The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the general store in Cedar Ridge, a small frontier town nestled between rolling hills and endless prairie. Martha Henley stood motionless, her calico dress catching the early breeze, watching the distant figure of a horseman grow smaller against the horizon. The letter in her hand trembled slightly, not from the wind, but from the weight of the words she'd just read. Thomas Mitchell, the man she'd planned to marry come autumn, had decided that the banker's daughter in Denver offered better prospects than a shopkeeper's daughter in a town that barely appeared on most maps. I hope you understand, Martha. A man has to think of his future. You're a fine woman, but this territory is too uncertain. I need stability. The dust from his horse's departure settled slowly, like her hopes sinking into the hard-packed earth. Martha didn't cry. She'd learned long ago that tears were a luxury women like her couldn't afford. Instead, she stood there absorbing the silence that followed his hoofbeats, the crumpled letter falling from her fingers to rest against her worn boots. Cedar Ridge continued its daily rhythm around her. Mrs. Patterson swept her porch across the street, casting sympathetic glances. The blacksmith's hammer rang against metal. Children chased each other between the buildings, their laughter seeming distant and foreign. Martha had known Thomas for 2 years. He'd courted her properly, speaking with her father, bringing her small gifts from his trips to neighboring towns. She'd allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the general store, perhaps a house with real glass windows, maybe even children of her own. The October wind picked up, carrying the scent of dried grass and the promise of winter. Martha pulled her shawl tighter, not against the cold, but against the emptiness that was settling into her chest like a stone. "Martha," her father's voice called from inside the store. "The Henderson order needs to be prepared." She bent to retrieve the letter, smoothing it against her skirt before folding it carefully. Some part of her couldn't quite let go, even now. Walking back inside, she tucked it into her apron pocket, where it would remain hidden but never forgotten. The store smelled of leather, coffee beans, and the soap her mother used to make before the fever took her 3 years ago. Martha moved through the familiar motions, measuring flour, counting nails, wrapping purchases in brown paper. Her hands worked automatically, while her mind struggled to accept what her heart already knew. Thomas was gone. The future she'd imagined was gone with him. As evening approached and the last customer departed, Martha found herself sweeping the same spot on the floor over and over, the rhythmic motion the only thing keeping her anchored to the present moment. 3 days passed before Martha saw him. She was hanging laundry behind the store, the rope line stretching between 2 cottonwood trees that provided the only shade in their small yard. The October air was crisp, and her breath formed small clouds as she pinned her father's shirts and her own simple dresses to dry. The man sat on a weathered tree stump about 30 feet away, near the edge of their property where it met the open grassland. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting, his hat pulled low, hands resting on his knees. A bay horse grazed nearby, reins loose but within reach. Martha paused, a clothespin halfway to the line. Most strangers passing through Cedar Ridge stopped at the saloon or the hotel. They didn't sit quietly in empty lots, watching the wind move through the grass. He wore the practical clothing of a working man. Dark trousers, a worn leather vest over a blue shirt, boots that had seen considerable use. His hair, what she could see beneath his hat, was the color of wheat, ready for harvest. When she finished hanging the laundry, he was still there. She gathered the empty basket and glanced in his direction once more. He hadn't moved, but she sensed rather than saw that he was aware of her presence. That evening, as she helped her father close the store, she mentioned the stranger, sitting out by the trees. Her father, Samuel Henley, looked up from the ledger where he recorded the day's transactions. "Saw him myself when I went to check the back storage. Seems peaceful enough. But what's he doing there? Maybe resting. Could be his horse threw a shoe, or maybe he's just thinking. Men do that sometimes, Martha, especially men who've been riding alone for a long while." The next morning, as she swept the front porch, Martha saw him again. This time he was standing near the small creek that ran behind the town, his horse drinking from the clear water. The morning light caught the lines of his profile. Strong jaw, straight nose, the kind of face that suggested both gentleness and determination. She found herself wondering where he was from, where he was going, and why he'd chosen to linger in a place where most people only stayed long enough to buy supplies and move on. On the third day, their paths crossed. Martha was returning from the doctor's house, where she'd delivered medicine for his wife's arthritis, when she found the stranger examining a broken wheel on a supply wagon that had been abandoned near the town's entrance. The wagon belonged to the Murphy family, who'd left it there after their horse went lame 2 days prior. "It's been sitting there since Tuesday," Martha said, approaching cautiously. "The Murphys took their horse to Benson's ranch to recover." The man looked up, and Martha saw his eyes for the first time, grey like storm clouds, but with a warmth that surprised her. He touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Seems like a decent wagon," he said. His voice was deep, measured, with the slight drawl common to men who'd spent time in Texas. "Shame to leave it broken when it just needs a new spoke and some attention. Are you a wheelwright?" "I've fixed my share of wheels." He stood, brushing dust from his hands. "I'm James Crawford. I've been visiting your town for a few days." "Martha Henley. My father and I run the general store." She paused, then added, "Most visitors don't stay this long in Cedar Ridge." James looked toward the distant mountains, their peaks already touched with snow. "Sometimes a place grows on you. Sometimes you find you're not quite ready to move on." There was something in the way he said it that made Martha think he understood about not being ready, about needing time to heal from things that couldn't be rushed. "Would the Murphys mind if I fixed their wagon?" he asked. "I've got time, and I don't like seeing things broken when they don't have to be." Martha studied his face, searching for hidden motives, but finding only genuine concern. "I think they'd be grateful. Tom Murphy's getting too old to do heavy repair work, and they need that wagon for winter supplies." James nodded and turned his attention back to the wheel. As Martha continued toward town, she heard the sound of him testing the damaged spokes, his movements careful and methodical. That evening, she watched from her bedroom window as James worked by lamplight, shaping a new spoke with tools he'd apparently carried in his saddlebags. He worked with the focused attention of a man who found peace in repairing things, in making broken things whole again. For the first time since Thomas left, Martha fell asleep without replaying his goodbye in her mind. The repaired wagon was ready by morning. Martha discovered this when she stepped outside to collect eggs from their small chicken coop. The wagon sat where it had been, but now it looked sturdy and ready for travel. The new spoke was slightly lighter in color than the others, but it fit perfectly, and the wheel turned smoothly when she gave it an experimental push. James was nowhere to be seen, but his horse grazed in the same spot near the cottonwoods, suggesting he hadn't left town. "Did you see this?" she called to her father as he emerged from the store. Samuel examined the repair work, running his hands along the wheel rim and testing the axle. "Professional work," he said with approval. "This Crawford fellow knows his trade." Throughout the morning, customers commented on the wagon. Word spread quickly in Cedar Ridge. A stranger had fixed the Murphy wagon without being asked, without seeking payment or recognition. In a community where everyone struggled just to survive another winter, such generosity was both rare and deeply appreciated. Martha found herself watching for James as she went about her daily tasks. She spotted him once, helping old Henrik Johnson carry firewood to his cabin. Later, Mrs. Patterson mentioned that someone had repaired her broken garden gate, though she couldn't say who. It was near noon when Martha saw him again, sitting in his usual spot by the trees. This time, she made a decision that surprised even her. She prepared a plate of food, fresh bread, butter, some dried beef, and coffee in a jar that would stay warm for a short while. Her hands moved automatically, but her heart raced as she walked across the dried grass toward him. James looked up as she approached, and she saw no surprise in his expression, as if he'd been expecting her. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, offering the plate. "That's kind of you." He accepted the food with a slight nod. "Though I don't want to be any trouble." "It's no trouble." Martha hesitated, then sat on a smaller rock nearby. "My father says you do good work. The Murphy wagon looks like new." "Tom Murphy seems like a decent man. Decent men deserve decent wagons." They sat in comfortable silence while James ate. Martha found herself studying the landscape as if seeing it for the first time. The way the afternoon light turned the grass golden, how the distant mountains seemed to change color as clouds passed overhead. "You've lived here long?" James asked. "All my life. My mother used to say Cedar Ridge chose us, not the other way around." Martha picked at a thread on her skirt. "She said some people belong to places and some places belong to people. Your mother sounds wise." She was. Martha's voice grew softer. "She died 3 years ago. Fever took half the town that winter." James set down his coffee jar and looked at her directly. "I'm sorry for your loss." The simple words, spoken without elaborate sympathy or awkward comfort, somehow meant more than all the well-intentioned condolences she'd received at the time. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you belong to a place?" James was quiet for a long moment, watching his horse move slowly through the grass. "I thought I did once. Had a ranch down in Texas, near San Antonio. 160 acres, good water, decent soil. What happened to it? Drought, bank foreclosure, the usual story." His voice remained steady, but Martha heard the carefully controlled pain beneath the words. "Some places let you go easier than others." Martha understood something in that moment. James wasn't just passing through Cedar Ridge. He was healing from his own goodbye, his own loss. Perhaps that's why he'd stayed. Why he'd noticed her standing there the morning Thomas left. People who've been broken recognize the signs in others. "I'm sorry," she said, echoing his earlier words. "Things happen," James replied. "The important thing is what you do after they happen." As the afternoon wore on, they talked about small things. The coming winter, the challenges of frontier life, the way the wind sounded different in the mountains than it did on the plains. Martha found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since her mother's death, perhaps even before that. When she finally rose to return to the store, James stood as well. "Thank you for the meal," he said, "and the company. Will you—" Martha paused, unsure how to ask what she wanted to know. "Will you be staying in Cedar Ridge much longer?" James looked toward the town, then back at her. "I reckon that depends on whether I'm needed here." That evening, as Martha helped her father prepare for the next day's business, she found herself humming, something she hadn't done since Thomas left. Her father noticed, but said nothing, though she caught him smiling as he counted the day's receipts. Outside, the wind carried the sound of James working on something near his camping spot. The steady rhythm of his tools was somehow comforting, like a heartbeat that promised tomorrow would come and that someone would be there to meet it. 2 weeks later, Tom Murphy returned to collect his wagon. Martha watched from the store window as the old rancher examined the repair work, running weathered hands along the new spoke and testing the wheel's balance. His face broke into a surprised smile, and he walked directly to where James sat, cleaning his horse's tack. The conversation was brief but animated. Tom gestured toward the wagon, clearly offering payment, but James shook his head. After several minutes of what appeared to be good-natured argument, Tom clasped James's shoulder and walked back toward his ranch, driving the restored wagon with obvious pride. Later that afternoon, Tom returned with his wife, Helen, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Where is he?" Helen Murphy called to Martha. "Where's the man who fixed our wagon?" Martha pointed toward the trees, where James was splitting firewood he'd apparently cut for the approaching winter. Helen marched across the grass with the determination of a woman on a mission, her husband following with an amused expression. From her position at the store's entrance, Martha couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw Helen thrust the basket into James's hands, wave away his protests, and pat his cheek like he was one of her own sons before returning to town with Tom. As evening approached, James appeared at the store's front door, basket in hand. "Mrs. Murphy seems to think I need feeding," he said with a slight smile. "Helen Murphy thinks everyone needs feeding," Martha replied. "What did she bring you?" "Enough food for a week by the smell of it. Beef stew, fresh bread, some kind of pie." He shifted the basket. "More than one man can eat, certainly." Martha understood the unspoken invitation. "Father's eating at the hotel tonight. Monthly meeting with the other business owners. I was just going to have bread and cheese. Would you care to share a proper meal?" They ate at the small table behind the store, the one Martha and her father used for their own meals. Helen Murphy's stew was rich with beef and vegetables, seasoned with herbs that made the simple meal feel like a celebration. "She put effort into this," Martha observed, savoring the complex flavors. "People here take care of each other," James said. "That's rare in my experience. We have to. Nearest town of any size is 3 days' ride. If we don't look after our own, who will? Still, not every place works that way, even when it should." As they ate, Martha found herself studying James's face in the lamplight. The sharp angles she'd noticed that first day had softened somehow, or perhaps she was simply seeing him more clearly. His hands, strong from years of manual work, handled his fork with surprising gentleness. "James," she said finally, "why did you really stay in Cedar Ridge?" He set down his fork and considered the question seriously. "At first, because my horse needed rest, and I needed to think. Then, because I saw you standing there that morning, looking like—" He paused, searching for words. "Looking like I felt inside, lost, like something important had just ended." Martha's breath caught slightly. "You saw that?" "I recognized it. When you've been broken yourself, you learn to spot it in others." James met her eyes directly. "I stayed because sometimes, when you're falling apart, the best thing someone can do is just not leave. Thomas, the man who left, he said I should understand that a man has to think of his future. Maybe he did what he thought was right for him, but understanding something doesn't make it hurt less." Martha nodded, surprised by how much relief she felt at having someone acknowledge her pain without trying to minimize it or rush her past it. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Winter's coming. You can't camp outside much longer." "I've been thinking about that." James hesitated, then continued. "Henrik Johnson mentioned that his cabin has a back room he's not using. Says he could use help with repairs before the snow comes. It wouldn't be permanent, but you'd stay through winter. If the town would have me, if—" He stopped, then started again. "If you think it would be all right." Martha realized that her answer mattered to him in a way that went beyond practical concerns. He wasn't just asking about lodging or work. He was asking if she wanted him to stay. "I think," she said carefully, "that Cedar Ridge could use a man who fixes things that are broken." Something shifted in James's expression, relief, gratitude, and something warmer that Martha wasn't quite ready to name. "And I think," she continued more boldly, "that you were right about not leaving. Sometimes that's exactly what someone needs, just someone who has the courage to stay." Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, carrying the scent of coming snow. But inside the warm circle of lamplight, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced since her mother's death. The sense that tomorrow might hold something good. James reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. His touch was warm, steady, real. "I'm not going anywhere, Martha," he said quietly. "Not unless you ask me to." Martha looked down at their joined hands, then back at his face. "I won't ask you to leave." Later, as she prepared for bed, Martha found Thomas's letter in her apron pocket. She read it once more, but the words seemed to belong to someone else's story now. Carefully, she placed it in the bottom of her trunk, beneath her mother's quilt and her grandmother's Bible. Some chapters ended with goodbyes, But others, she was learning, began with someone who chose to stay. Outside her window, she could see the warm glow of lamplight from Henrik's cabin, where James was settling into his new temporary home. The sight filled her with a contentment she hadn't expected to feel again. Cedar Ridge slept peacefully under the vast Montana sky, and for the first time since Thomas left, Martha felt like she belonged exactly where she was, with exactly the right person choosing to be there beside her. The spring of 1879 brought the earliest thaw Cedar Ridge had seen in a decade. Martha Crawford stood on the porch of her house, their house, watching her husband secure a load of lumber to their wagon. The sight still amazed her sometimes. James, moving through morning tasks with the easy confidence of a man who belonged exactly where he was. "You sure you don't want to come to Billings with me?" James called, testing the rope that held the boards in place. "It's a 3-day trip, and Sarah Morrison says their mercantile has fabrics you can't get here." Martha adjusted the baby against her shoulder, smiling at the way little Samuel's tiny fist curled around her finger. At 8 months old, he had his father's grey eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. "Someone needs to mind the store while you're gone. Besides, Mrs. Patterson promised to help me start the vegetable garden this week." James secured the final knot and walked over to where she stood. He brushed a gentle finger across Samuel's cheek, then leaned down to kiss Martha's forehead. Even after 2 years of marriage, such casual affection still sent warmth through her chest. "I'll miss you both," he said softly. "It's only 3 days. We'll be here when you get back." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. In the early months after their wedding, Martha had sometimes woken with a start, reaching across the bed to make sure James was still there. The fear of another goodbye had taken time to fade, replaced gradually by the steady certainty of his presence. Their courtship had been gentle and unhurried. Through that first winter, James had indeed stayed in Henrik's back room, spending his days helping neighbors prepare for the harsh months ahead. He'd reinforced roofs, chopped firewood, and repaired tools with the same quiet competence he'd shown with the Murphy wagon. Martha had found reasons to visit Henrik's cabin, bringing soup when the old man took sick, borrowing books from his small library, checking on repairs James was making to the chimney. These visits had become the foundation of their relationship. They shared conversations over coffee, quiet moments working side by side, the gradual recognition that they understood each other in ways that went beyond words. The proposal had come in May, almost 7 months after Thomas's departure. James had been helping Martha plant her mother's rose bushes, carefully preserved through the winter, when he'd stopped suddenly, his hands still dirty from the soil. "Martha," he'd said, not looking at her directly, "I know I don't have much to offer. No land of my own, no family name to speak of. But I love you, and I believe, I hope, that you might feel something similar for me." She'd continued planting for a moment, considering not just his words, but everything that had led to them. The way he'd never tried to rush her healing, never demanded explanations for her quiet days, or pushed for more than she was ready to give. The way he'd become part of Cedar Ridge's fabric so naturally that newcomers assumed he'd always lived there. "I do love you," she'd said finally, meeting his eyes, "and you're wrong about not having much to offer. You've given me something Thomas never could." "What's that?" "The certainty that you'll still be here tomorrow, and the day after that, for as long as we both shall live." They'd married in August, with the entire town gathering in front of the church for the ceremony. Henrik had walked Martha down the aisle, her father being too overcome with emotion to trust his own legs. Tom Murphy had stood as James's best man, and Helen Murphy had wept so loudly during the vows that her husband had to pass her his handkerchief. The reception had been held in the space behind the general store, with tables borrowed from every household in town. Mrs. Patterson had organized the women into preparing a feast that lasted well into the evening, and even stern Dr. Matthews had been seen dancing with his wife as the sun set behind the mountains. Now, watching James prepare for his trip to purchase materials for the town's new schoolhouse, a project he'd volunteered to oversee, Martha marveled at how thoroughly their lives had intertwined with the community around them. "Papa Henrik wants to know if you'll check on his arthritis while I'm gone," James said, referring to Henrik Johnson by the name little Samuel had inexplicably chosen for the old man. "Says it's been acting up with this weather change." "Of course. I'll take him some of that willow bark tea tomorrow." James climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. His horse, the same bay that had grazed near the cottonwoods during those first uncertain days, stood patiently in the traces. "Give my love to everyone. Tell them I'll be back Friday evening with news from the outside world. Travel safely." Martha watched the wagon roll down Cedar Ridge's main street until it disappeared around the bend that led to the mountain pass. Other wives had gathered on their porches to wave goodbye to their own husbands, making the supply run, and Martha felt the familiar comfort of being part of something larger than herself. Baby Samuel made a small sound against her shoulder, and she carried him inside their house, the same building that had once held only the general store and her father's living quarters, now expanded to include proper family rooms and a workshop where James crafted furniture during the long winter evenings. The store itself had grown too. James's reputation as a skilled craftsman had brought customers from neighboring towns, seeking everything from wagon repairs to custom-built cabinets. Martha had expanded their inventory to include more varied goods, and they now served as the unofficial post office and banking house for the entire region. "Look who's awake," Martha said to Samuel as she settled into the rocking chair James had made during her pregnancy. "Shall we read this letter from Aunt Sarah?" Samuel gurgled happily as Martha opened the letter from her childhood friend, who had moved to Denver the previous year. Sarah's news was full of city excitement, electric lights being installed on main streets, a new opera house, fashions arriving from back east. But as Martha read, she felt no envy for Sarah's sophisticated life. Cedar Ridge had given her something more valuable than city conveniences. A place where she was known completely and loved unconditionally, where her contributions mattered, where she could see the direct impact of her choices on the lives around her. A knock at the door interrupted her reading. Martha opened it to find young Billy Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's grandson, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Crawford, but Grandma sent me to ask if you could come quick. Mrs. Henderson's time has come, and she's asking for you special." Martha's heart quickened. This would be the fourth birth she'd attended since Dr. Matthews had begun training her as his unofficial assistant. The doctor's hands were growing less steady with age, and he'd recognized Martha's natural skill with women in labor. "Tell your grandmother I'll be there in 10 minutes, Martha said. "Run ahead and tell her to boil water and gather clean towels." Billy nodded and raced back down the street with the importance of his mission. Martha quickly prepared her medical bag, another skill learned from Dr. Matthews, and bundled Samuel into his warmest blanket. Mrs. Patterson would watch him during the delivery, as she had for Martha's other medical calls. Walking through town toward the Henderson cabin, Martha reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning 3 years ago when she'd stood watching Thomas ride away. Then she'd felt like her story was ending. Now, hurrying to help bring new life into the world, she understood that it had only been a chapter break. The Henderson cabin was already bustling with activity when Martha arrived. Elizabeth Henderson, a young woman who'd married into the community the previous summer, was pacing the small main room with the determined expression of someone trying to stay ahead of her pain. "Thank goodness you're here," said Mrs. Patterson, taking Samuel from Martha's arms. "The pains started before dawn, and they're coming closer together." Martha spent the next several hours coaching Elizabeth through labor, drawing on her training and intuition to provide comfort and guidance. When baby Henderson finally arrived, a healthy girl with strong lungs and an impressive will, Martha felt the same wonder she'd experienced at every birth she'd attended. "She's perfect," Elizabeth whispered, tears streaming down her face as Martha placed the baby in her arms. "She is indeed," Martha agreed, watching the new mother count tiny fingers and toes. "Have you chosen a name?" Martha," Elizabeth said softly. "We want to call her Martha after you, if that's all right." Martha felt her own eyes fill with tears. "I'd be honored." As evening fell and mother and baby were settled comfortably, Martha walked home through the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge. Samuel slept against her shoulder, exhausted by the day's excitement. The lamp lights in cabin windows created a warm glow against the darkness, and Martha could hear the comfortable sounds of families gathering for evening meals. At home, she lit her own lamps and prepared a simple supper. As she moved through the familiar tasks, Martha's thoughts turned to James, probably making camp somewhere along the mountain trail. She missed him, with the gentle ache of someone who knew he would return, who trusted in the promise of his presence. Later, as she settled Samuel in his cradle and prepared for bed, Martha paused at her bedroom window. The view looked out toward the cottonwood trees, where James had first made his camp, where she'd taken him that first meal, where they'd begun to understand each other's stories. The trees were larger now, their branches creating deeper shadows in the moonlight, but the peace of that place remained unchanged. A quiet spot where broken things could heal, where new stories could begin. Martha thought of Thomas sometimes, usually without pain. She'd heard through traveling merchants that he'd married the banker's daughter and opened a store in Denver. She hoped he was happy, hoped he'd found whatever security he'd been seeking, but she no longer wondered what might have been if he'd stayed. Some people, she'd learned, pass through your life like seasons, bringing their own gifts and challenges before moving on. Others, like James, became part of the landscape itself, changing the very shape of your world until you couldn't imagine it without them. A soft knock at the front door surprised her. Martha wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and went to investigate, finding Dr. Matthews on her porch with his medical bag. "Heard about the Henderson baby," he said with a smile. "Thought you might want to know. Word came back from Billings today. The Territorial Medical Board approved your application for midwife certification. You're official now, Martha." Martha stared at him in amazement. She'd applied months ago, encouraged by James and her father, but uncertain whether her informal training would be sufficient. Official. Which means you can charge proper fees for your services, and more importantly, you can train other women in the territory. We need skilled midwives, Martha. You're going to help save lives. After Dr. Matthews left, Martha sat in her kitchen, holding the certification papers and thinking about the unexpected directions life could take. 3 years ago, she'd thought her future was mapped out clearly. Now she was a wife, mother, business owner, and certified midwife in a community that had become her true home. When James returned Friday evening, Martha was waiting on the porch just as she had that first morning, but with happiness instead of heartbreak. Samuel sat on her lap, clapping his hands at the sight of his father's approaching wagon. "How did it go?" James called as he climbed down from the driver's seat. "We have news," Martha said, standing to greet him. "Several pieces of news." James gathered both wife and son into his arms, and Martha breathed in the familiar scent of leather and wood smoke that always clung to his clothes. "Tell me everything," he said, and Martha knew he meant it literally. James, never tired of hearing about her days, never considered any detail too small to matter. As they walked into their house together, Martha began the stories that would carry them through the evening. The birth of little Martha Henderson, her midwife certification, the town gossip Mrs. Patterson had shared, Samuel's first successful attempts at sitting up alone. Outside, Cedar Ridge settled into another peaceful night, unaware that its newest certified midwife was planning how to expand her medical training, or that its finest carpenter was considering a proposal to build additional rooms onto the schoolhouse, or that their baby was dreaming whatever dreams 8-month-old children dream. But the mountains knew, and the cottonwood trees, and the wind that had carried away one man's goodbye and brought another man's decision to stay. They held these stories like treasures, adding them to the countless other human dramas that had played out beneath the vast Montana sky. And in the morning, they would all be there still, the town, the mountains, the trees, and the people who had chosen to call this place home, ready for whatever new chapters the future might bring.